Hey guys, so this is the third lecture for this week. Actually, it's number two in general, but um, right now, what we're going to start talking about, or what I'm going to start talking about, is going to be art history. So the first part of the semester is about art and what art is, what it isn't, how you make it, materials, all of those things. The other half of the semester is going to be art history. Now, the way I teach art history is different than a regular art history class. In a regular art history class, you will see that the teacher will show you artworks. She's going to talk a little bit about the artwork, maybe the artist, tell you about the date, the era of art, and so forth and so on. And then you, after a period of time, will take a test and basically regurgitate all the information that was given, dates and all that. Now, I do not teach art history that way. The way I teach art history is more of a story. I really like the idea of continuity for you guys to understand how art evolved throughout the ages and the connectivity between the past and the future, or the past and the present of that period of time, and how everything is interconnected, like I just said. So you'll see um, that the context is going to be much more connected to one another rather than disconnected like in a regular art class. Um, Another thing that I want you to really keep in mind is that I oversimplify a lot of things just to make them clear, just to make them much more easily to understand, and things like that. So please keep that in mind that I am in most cases simplifying quite a bit of the information I'm giving you. We're going through, quite a bit of time in art information in basically half of the semester, so I don't have the time to go in detail into a lot of it. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the very beginning, and the very beginning is the Paleolithic period. So Paleolithic just basically means ancient stone, and it's a prehistoric period when human beings starts developing tools. Now, we're not thinking of tools like we know them nowadays, but rather very simplistic type of tools using stones to crush or twigs and to acquire insects, those kind of things, those kind of primitive stones. Tools. Actually, and contemporarily, we found out that a lot of other animals in our world right now use tools similarly to what this is talking about, right? So we have some primates nowadays that use tools. We actually have invertebrates that use tools, etc. However, obviously for us, we evolved and our tools got much more sophisticated. Now, with Paleolithic period, because it takes so long for our brains to develop and to evolve to what they are as Homo sapiens, it actually covers about 95% of what we consider to be prehistory, right? So 95% of human technological prehistory. Now, that 95% of time extends about 2.6 million years, and it goes to around 10,000 BCE. So let's take a look. We're going to start here at 2.6 million years before the Common Era, and we're going to start moving towards the present. So about 2 million years BCE. Okay, this is the era in the area in which we're talking about, and the kind of humanoids we're discussing about is going to be Homo habilis. Just to give you an idea what that looks like, here's Homo habilis. And here's the time period that we're going to be discussing. So as you notice, there's all the different humanoid branches, and here we are. So this is what we're going to be discussing. So with the Paleolithic period, as I mentioned before, the tools is what becomes much more prominent in the history. So tools are being used to control the surroundings, to obtain more food, to protect ourselves, and so forth and so on. Now, one of the things that are happening with these tools and that differentiate ourselves from other species is this ability to imagine, to think further than our own environment and think about possibilities. Now, one of the things about imagination that is important is to think about why we adorn things. Why do we decorate different things around us? What would be the case? Well, before I go any further, let me answer that question. So why do we adorn things? Normally I would ask you in class to tell me a reason why we adorn things, but the bottom line is we adorn things to differentiate from what's mine to what is yours. So the way I dress is to identify myself as me. If I decorate my backpack a specific way, it's going to be to differentiate from yours, and so forth and so on. So if you think about it in a much more primitive way, differentiation or decorating something, making it say this is mine and this is yours, can be the difference between life and death in many cases, because you're acquiring your own food or your own tools and things like that. So that's why imagination and the ability to adorn things, it's so important. Now, as we move forward, as you can see, as we move forward into time, this is, what, 1 million years, right? So as we move a whole million years worth of time, then we have humanoids now living in the area of Europe and Asia, so Eurasia. And in this time period, those tools that we talked about, the simplified tools that we're just used for crushing or splitting or gathering insects, have become much more refined. So these ones now have chipped edges that can be used for cutting, and therefore acquiring bigger gain, and better food. Another thing that you're going to see further into time is there's going to be this very well developed way of creating those edges, those edges where you can cut or that you can put on stones in order to kill or to hunt, right? So in this case, we're talking about the appreciation for the relationship between form and function. Meaning that if you have an arrowhead that is very well done symmetrically and that edge is beautifully sharp, then that arrowhead is a much better arrowhead because of the way that it was made, right? So the relationship between form and function, how well something is created and how well it actually works. I apologize for that tongue twister right there. All right. Anyways, so if we move forward in time down to 100,000 BCE, we're starting to see different things. Not only just well-made tools or the appreciation how good a tool works because it's well done, but also we're starting to see things in the realm of spirituality. We start seeing things like sprinkled powders and beads in tombstones or areas of burial, which gives us a context that we're understanding our lives beyond our own. So we're expanding and we're starting to question what happens in the afterlife in some ways. So in some cases, a context of religion or spirituality, but definitely a sense of ritual, especially when it comes down to death. So, what other elements do we have that shows this context of humanity? Around 77,000 BCE, we find one of the oldest artistic objects. And this is all the way in South Africa. And this is what the object looks like. Very, very simple. It's just a stone with some carvings in the edge of it. Now, why do we call this the first artistic object? If you look at it, you'll see that it's just a piece of stone that is being decorated. There is no functionality to this object whatsoever. So this is only for expression, for decoration, embellishment, and that's it, nothing else. So there's nothing functional about this object, therefore it becomes the first artistic object that we have. This object also gives us a sense that we are thinking beyond what is necessary, so the everyday, and therefore gives us a sense of what we recognize now as the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution is just our ability to think, like I mentioned, just beyond the everyday. Imagine what's going to happen and how we can transform our lives for a better future. So that's what cognitive revolution is. All right. So as we move forward in time, right about 40,000 BCE, we get to the end of the Ice Age. Now, in this case, as you guys know, with the Ice Age, we have a lot of nomad groups throughout Europe and Asia, into the Americas as well. Now, this context gives a sense of culture. And some of the elements, artistic objects that show this level of culture are going to be these objects that are found throughout Europe, or have been found throughout Europe and throughout Asia as well. So every time that we find an object, a female or a figure of a female from one specific area, and we call those Venus, a Venus. So in this case, it's the Venus of Hoffiel's. Okay, and it's about 38,000 to 33,000 BCE timeline, and it's made of ivory, and it was found in southwestern Germany. Now this object is fairly small. Here's where it was found. So there is Europe, there's Germany, and that's about where it was located. But it's fairly small. It's a fairly small object, and I want to show you about a scale on what that looks like. There you go. And if you notice here, you'll see that that is a little hole. Right, so you could imagine that this had a thread or something through it, almost like a charm. So what can this tell us? Well, pretty simple. It's an object that is made out of stone, out of a bone, which is fairly light, and the fact that it has that thread means that it was meant to be worn somehow. So whether it was worn by a necklace, maybe a bracelet, or even kept on a backpack of sorts, nevertheless, it was an object that was easy to carry, and it was something that was meant to be seen often, right? So this object, given the fact that it's a female figure, gives its context of the importance of motherhood, of being able to procreate, and maybe it's given to the person who might be of age of procreation, somewhat of a good luck charm or a passage, a rite of passage because of age. So it's kind of a charm, kind of something that's fairly positive. Now, a similar object is this one right here, and this is the Venus of Willendorf. So the Venus of Willendorf is a little bit younger, let's put it that way. That's only 28,000, 25,000 BCE. This one is made out of stone, so it's much heavier, and it was also found in southwestern Germany. So I'll give you an idea of where it was found. And to give you an idea of scale of difference, then you have, there is the two Venuses. So it's slightly larger. Now think about this one. This one is heavier. So carrying this around with you would have been a stress in some ways. Why? Well, because you're a nomad and you only carry your essentials, but yet you're carrying this stone with you. So while this one might be of a lucky charm of sort, something to carry around, that's a positive thing, this one might be much more of a way to remind you of your responsibilities as a female, right? So bearing children as well, and those kind of elements, but in a much more literally heavy way, rather than a much softer, lighter way. So this is kind of what that would be like, right? So this object here, which represents the idealistic female figure, and then kind of a something I found on the internet right here that I thought it was great. So it gives us a context on how this object was seen and portrayed in some ways in a contemporary context. All right. So now that we get to the 40,000 BC, we talked about all of this right here. All the things that you're going to find are going to be caves with paintings in them, and these are the ones that are kind of stereotypically in our mind that we see fairly common, and that I've shown you already before. And these caves show a lot of human forms as well as animal forms, and they were painted. There we go. And they're painted with all kinds of natural pigments like we discussed before. Now in the past I showed you an image from Lascaux, and this one's from a different location. This is Chauvet in France, and that's basically where it's located. By 10,000 BCE, as I mentioned before, we have the end of the Paleolithic period, and now we start a new era. So right now we went over basically 2 million years worth of history. And in the 2 million years, basically the only thing that happened was the evolution of tools and how we interacted with the environment and how we went from kind of being minded on our own to much bigger than ourselves into culture as well as spirituality. So at this point, we move into the new period, Neolithic, right? New stone. The Neolithic period is basically highlighted because at this point we start working as farmers. So we're no longer completely running around, but now we start being much more sedentary. So we went from nomadic to hunters and farmers. That's the difference between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic period. And it's not as long of a period of time, right? This is the time we have the agricultural revolution before the Bronze Age, and extends only about, like I said, 8,000 years, so between 10,000 BCE to about 2000 BCE. So in this timeline that I showed you before, this is about the period that we're going to be discussing. This is the full prehistory of humankind. So the very last little bit is the Neolithic period. Now, in the Neolithic period, you're going to find objects that are still somewhat connected to the Paleolithic period. These are some of the carvings. And a carving on stone is called what we call a petroglyph. So a petroglyph is a rock carving. And this one is from this archipelago right here on the western side of Australia. All the carvings or paintings on walls in this case, right? This is a pictograph. These pictographs are actually on Horseshoe Canyon, Utah. It's also a Neolithic artwork. And if you ever go to Utah, you should stop by and take a look at these things. They're absolutely amazing. So here we are. That's where those ones are located. Now, by 3000 BCE, we have much better tools. Like I said, we are farmers. We're staying in one single location, so we're acquiring objects, we're creating objects, and the objects that we're acquiring and creating are objects that are going to be for food, drink, vessels, those kind of things, and all those objects are going to be decorated. Now, it's interesting to understand that most of the decorations back then were completely abstracted, especially geometrically abstracted. We think about abstraction as something that is modern or contemporary, but the reality is that abstraction is one of the oldest forms of art, if not the oldest form of art. So let's look at some of the things that were decorated with the abstract geometric patterns that were used for daily use. Now, a lot of those geometric abstract art patterns derive from animals and plants. So here's a great example of one of them. So this is an earthenware beaker. Hopefully you guys remember from the last PowerPoint. The earthenware is a clay that's mid-fire clay. So once it's fired, it goes to a point where it can hold water, liquids, right? It's non-porous anymore. Anyways, so in this case, if you can see, we have different objects here that are being abstracted. So the very first one, the most obvious one, is going to be this goat right here, right? So we have the horns and so forth and so on. Now, what would this goat be located at? If you look around, there's actually a fence around it, and that fence is keeping out these wolves, sorry, that are dogs of some sort, right? So here we have the dogs, and then further out into the distance, then we have this water with these birds, very simplified birds. So here's the beak, the bodies of the birds, and the two legs, and you have those animals all the way around that beaker. So a pretty simple depiction of their lives in this beaker. And if it was a label, if this was to be a label, right, what would be a label for? Well, if it's goat, what kind of goat liquid would we have in here? Goat milk, right? And it's actually what the beaker was mainly used for. How do we know what it was used for? Well, because the inside of the beaker was tested, and we find a lot of residue of goat milk in there. A different object found in, oh, sorry, this is where it was located, Iran. Another object similar is this one right here. This one's from China, right? So looking at the pattern, most people automatically recognize what this object was used for. Even though it's so simplified and we really don't have a label that, like a word that says what it is, the imagery gives us a sense of what it was for, right? Most of us read water. So whether you read the water through this context, these waves, or whether it's these waves, for some reason we all pretty quickly realize this is for water. One of the other things that's pretty neat about it is that it gives us even a line to where how far out the beaker or the container we should fill it out with. It's pretty neat. And here's where it was located. Also within the Neolithic period, we're going to have some structures. Now, this is not really architecture. Architecture would be a building where people can reside in or inhabit. These are structures. So these are things, just elements that were placed by humans for some specific reason. So let's look at some of the structures from the Neolithic period, and this is what they look like. These are called dolmens, okay, and you'll find quite a bit of those all throughout Europe. Now, one of the structures that is the most widely recognized throughout the world from the Neolithic period. Whoops, sorry, there we go. Let's forget that I show where those things are located. One of those Neolithic structures that they're very well recognized throughout the world is going to be Stonehenge. Right, so Stonehenge is a Neolithic structure. Neolithic structures. As you can see, the area of Stonehenge is quite large. Unfortunately, you're no longer able to step within the location, but it's a great example of Neolithic structures and architecture. Some of the things that you would know about Stonehenge is that it's aligned with the sun and the stars and other astronomical elements, and that is true. Other things that are interesting about Stonehenge is that because there is Neolithic structures all around Europe, most Neolithic structures that have the same symbols on them, you're able to find human remains somewhat close by. With Stonehenge, even though it does have the same elements, there has been no human remains found in Stonehenge. So that's one of those interesting things about Stonehenge that makes it a really interesting place. So pretty quickly we come to the end of the Neolithic period, and then we start what we now know, or what we've known as the Bronze Age. And Bronze Age is the beginning of civilization as we understand it. So what does that mean? So basically cultures with distinguished developments with fairly complex social orders and relatively high degree of technical development. One of the things to understand is that all these little civilizations emerge independently, especially the large ones. And we're going to go through not most of them, but some of the main ones, especially in the Western world. And we have to understand that they came up somewhat in different times in different locations, as I just mentioned. These are the three largest civilizations in the world at the same time. So one right here in the north of Africa, another one here in the Middle East, and the last one in Asia. So some of the key elements that allow these areas to evolve into civilization, one of them is cooperative living. So people helping one another, especially in the production of food through architecture. The other part is going to be domestication of animals, animal husbandry. So that is very, very, very important, and I'll explain that in a minute. The other one will be occupational specialization. So one group of people would do the agriculture, another one would take care of the animals, another one will take care of keeping track of the food, and so forth and so on. So not everybody had to do everything, but rather a group of people would do a specific task. Another very important part of this era is writing. And writing came about for the need to keeping track of the food. So we needed to count food, and we needed to know who got what. Once again, that need for distinction. So writing came from that. And last but not least, what makes the Bronze Age is the production of bronze. And bronze is a combination of lead and tin. Now this production of this metal allows us to have better tools, therefore better weapons, and with better weapons, larger empires, which gets us to Mesopotamia. Now, before we start talking about Mesopotamia, there's two things we need to discuss. The first one is, where did the bronze come from? Right? So bronze. So where did that come from? Think of what kind of process we've been doing so far as humans at this point that require high fire, a big amount of fire or heat. If you think about it, ceramics is the one thing that since we very began as humans, we're working with. So we would take mud or clay basically, and then heat it up, and then we have a vessel. And at some point, right, in the process of turning clay into ceramics, metal was discovered. So we knew that those metals slowly, where to find the metals, and slowly how to combine them, and so forth and so on, until we finally got to bronze. So that's something that is very important to understand, that next time you see something made of clay, that you find the importance, how important clay as a material is for us as humans. Now, the other thing that I want you guys to think about is going to be this. Let me go back a little bit. What is it, or what was it about these three different locations, these three groups of people, right, that made civilizations happen in these three areas and not all over the world, right? Because I've shown you so far that there has been individuals in Australia, in the Americas, and so forth and so on. So what happened? What is it that we had here in those three locations that the rest of the other areas did not have? Well, in order for me to explain that, the most basic way to explain it is through calories. Yes, calories, the stuff that you eat. We have to go back as far back as the Paleolithic period and talk about what our specialization is as an animal. So we decided in some ways, through natural selection and whatever else, that the one muscle or that we were going to focus on in some way was going to be the brain, right? So imagination and ideas was what we were working with. So in order to make a better tool, right, so that we can eat better, then we had to use our brains. Now, out of all the muscles in the body, the one that spends the most amount of energy is the brain, right? So in order to get a bigger brain, we need more calories, right? So we would come up with a tool that allows us to get more calories. And since we're acquiring more calories, then we have a bigger brain. And because we have a bigger brain, our tools get better. And because our tools get better, then we're able to obtain better calories, and so forth and so on, right? Until we evolve the brain and the tools necessary to really, be who we are right now, basically. Now, if you think about it, everybody in the world at some point was at the same level of evolution, right? So what was it? What was the element that allowed these three areas to go beyond, one step further, to really congregate or solidify, a better word, solidify what we consider to be civilizations? Well, believe it or not, the answer was already given. Animal domestication. In these areas of the world, then you had animals that were able to be domesticated. So we had pigs, you had goats, you had cows, and these other animals that were able to be domesticated. So the plus about having the kind of animals around you is that you no longer have to go and run after them, right? So the amount of calories that you would spend running after an antelope, you no longer had that. Instead, you can actually spend the energy on better ideas, on better organizing your society, on creating spending time on creating bigger families, and so forth and so on. So those areas where you were able to domesticate animals were the areas that got the most amount of people. And therefore, that's where civilizations were created. So calories is a very, very important thing, and that's how we get to these three locations. Now, out of those three locations, the Chinese empire was the largest and the strongest. And that is because they had one animal that these other two areas did not have. And that is the horse. The horse was the equivalent of the tank back then. So they were the ones who were best at war, and therefore they had the largest empire. And if you think about the history of the world, as the horse was slowly introduced into the rest of the world, the empires grew western, right? Eventually until we have obviously the Roman Empire, which took most of this area right here. And if you think about how the Americans, the Native Americans were taken over, right, was because of the Spanish and the English. And guess what they had? They had horses. So horses was this very important animal when it came down to expanding civilizations. So not only the weapons created large empires, but also the horses. All right. So let's talk about Mesopotamia and Egypt. So now we're starting to get into much more shorter periods of time. So we're expanding the timeline. And we'll start talking with Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia basically translates from Greek into the area between two rivers, right? It's land between two rivers. And the two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. I hope that you guys know this already. It's part of world history. You should have seen it in high school. But nevertheless, this is where the Tigris and the Euphrates are at. Those two main rivers. Right? And it's interesting to see where that's located given our contemporary times, right? So if I may, here is Iraq, right? And there's Iran right here. Then we have, Syria right here, Jordan, right? Lebanon, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. You know, a lot of locations we hear in the news every day, right? All these issues are happening is basically where we as a Western civilization are from. Now, other locations, much more specifically, Kirkuk, Baghdad, Babylon. Let's see what other ones we got. Palmyra, that's Aleppo. All of those areas are part of our historical background as Westerners, as Western civilization. Now, within this area of Mesopotamia, there were two main groups, right? One of them were the Sumerians, and the other ones were the Akkadians. Now, we're going to focus more on the Sumerians than we do in the Akkadians, right? And this is where the Sumerians existed, which is in the delta of the Euphrates and the Tigris. The Akkadians lived more on the northern side. Now, I don't know if you guys have read the book The Time Machine, right? And if you have, or if you've seen the movie, you know that in the time machine, in the future, sometime in the future, humankind was divided into two groups: the ones who basically evolved their brains, and the ones who evolved more the brunt, right? Well, Mesopotamia, Assyrian, Akkadians, and Sumerians were very much the same. Sumerians were all about intellect, or mainly about intellect, while Akkadians were not, or were more interested in expansion and power. Give me a second, guys. My laptop is running out of energy. Here we go. All right. Excellent. So, Sumerians and Akkadians. So, with Sumeria, one of the things to understand is that Sumerians are the ones who invented writing, and specifically the cuneiform writing. And this is basically a form of counting. It started as a form of counting, as I mentioned earlier, and eventually evolved into a full-blown alphabet. The other thing they invented was a wheel, not so much as the round wheel, but rather the spools and all of that. What is the more articulated wheel as we recognize it today. The plow, and also religion, a sense of religion and status one. Now, it is extremely important to understand that their religion was based on nature gods. So they were the god of the sun, the air, the rain, those kind of gods. And their politics were based on basically a context of how to interact with the environment. So religion and politics were basically tied hand to hand. So in the center of each one of the cities we have zaggurats. Zaggurats are basically sacred mountains, and they were located in the center of the city, as I mentioned earlier. Now the zaggurats were made, basically they were soft in the inside and hard on the outside. So the inside you had sun-baked bricks, so they were made out of clay, while the outside were actually fire, so they were ceramic bricks that were glazed. So they had a colorful facade. Nowadays, of course, we do not have the glazed ceramics on the outside, but we still have some of the buildings, some of the zaggurats from that era. Most zaggurats had two platforms in which you would have the shrine at the very top of the zaggurat. And here's what they look like. Now, one of the things that I love about looking at this structure is that it reminds me a lot of the Aztec pyramids. Obviously, there was no communication between both cultures, but it's amazing to see the similarities in structure form. Now, unfortunately, ISIS destroyed a lot of these elements as well in the Middle East. Some of them still survive, but unfortunately they destroyed quite a bit of them. And basically destruction of a lot of these elements from ISIS is because of that connection of the Western world to the past, and which is what we're discussing right now. Some of the elements from Sumeria includes the arts in music, literature, painting, sculpture, and so forth and so on. And in this case, we have kind of a combination of three of them, right? So we have sculpture, we have a music element, a lyra, but also we have here the story of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest story in the world. So if you ever get a chance to read Gilgamesh, you should. It's a very short story, and everybody should read it at least once. Alright. Here's another element, another sculptural element from this time period in Sumeria, and this is the head of an Akkadian ruler. So I had mentioned earlier, right, the Akkadians were much more war proud, let's put it that way. They were much more into expansion and power. Well, Akkadians eventually, throughout time, invaded the Sumerian area, and they ruled over the Sumerians for a while, until the Sumerians basically got tired and then pushed the Akkadians back out. And that cycle happened several times. And if you read Greek writers, you will see the stories of the Akkadians and the Sumerians, and a lot of this feud between both both groups of people. So you can see in this case we have the eyes gouged out and none in very good state. All right. Now the next step is going to be Egypt. So we talked about Sumeria, we talked about Mesopotamia, center of Western civilization, but Egypt is the other Western culture that we recognize as very important in our own Western history. So let's look about Egypt. Egypt lasted as a civilization for 2,500 years. To put that into context, the United States have been around as the United States for less than 500 years. So this is what? 5 times longer than we have been in the United States. So pretty long period of time. Now Egypt's located in the area in the northeast corner of Africa. Right over there. Right? And their civilization is very well known, and we recognize their architecture is very iconic and very well recognized. And we're going to look at some of the architecture. And as we all probably know, a lot of the architecture and religion was based on their beliefs, their religious belief, and their beliefs were very much tied to the afterlife, death. This is a very iconic architectural elements from Egypt, the pyramids. You guys probably, every single one of you probably recognize this. And all of you probably know what they're for, right? So there were tombstones, or basically tombs for different pharaohs. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that these objects were not the only burial types that there were in Egypt. There were all kinds of different types, and I'm going to show you a few other ones in a minute. But another thing that I want you to pay attention is the similarities between these objects and a zaggorat, right? These objects that stick out of the ground like mountains, that was of sacred function, right? So you can see that there was some kind of communication or cultural borrowing from both of the cultures. So they were not completely isolated. Now, this is 2500 BCE, right? And we're going to look later on in the same culture, right here, 1490 excuse me, BCE, and this is the funeral temple of Queen Hatshepsut. You see, completely different. So these are not pyramids; these are actually underground tombstones, not tombstones, but burials. And this is from the Valley of the Kings. So completely different, and it's 1,000 years later. So quite a bit of change. In regards to sculpture, there's several things that we have to keep in mind. And art in general, the way they depicted the human body, the figures, and a lot of the visual qualities. So one of the things that are very important for them is this embodiment of strength. So things have to be visually strong, and part of that strength was geometric structure. So you can simplify things into geometry. Another thing that was very important was this naturalistic and abstract idealism. What does that mean? Naturalistic just means that you can recognize nature, right? A lot of times people utilize the word realism, but that's really not quite right. Naturalism is more the correct terminology. So naturalistic means that represents nature. And abstract idealism, it just means that the object or the figure has been changed to be idealized, meaning that if the pharaoh was a little bit heavy, then we would make a sculpture where he has basically quote unquote a tummy tuck, right? Or if the pharaoh was a little bit long in the tooth, then we wouldn't probably not depict them with a lot of wrinkles, probably depict them a lot younger. So that's what abstract idealism is. Abstract meaning taken away, and idealism meaning it's going to be the best they could be, right? So not only is it going to look like the pharaoh, but also it's going to be abstracted in an idealistic way. So here's a couple of examples of those, right? So here you'll have an object, a sculpture that you guys have seen before. It's made of slate. Oops. And we want to see things that show strength, right? So what can show strength here? So we have a very strong body, right? We have a young body, physically strong, meaning you do have musculature. You also have the strength of this foot forward, meaning that he's a leader, so that also shows strength. Another element that shows strength is going to be the things that he's wearing, right? So that shows him to be the pharaoh. So that shows the power as well as the scepters that he has in both of his hands. Those are elements of strength. Another element of strength that sometimes in my classes gets overlooked is his wife, right? He's got a wife that cares for him, right? You can see that she is somewhat protective. And also she is side by side, almost shoulder to shoulder, and that shows strength. Two heads are better than one, right? And if you have a strong pharaoh with a strong wife, it makes for a strong country. So strength was the thing that they wanted to always show in the artwork and architecture. Another element that shows strength, believe it or not, is going to be the material. So color black, first of all, it's a strong color, but more than anything, the material itself, the slate is extremely hard to carve because when you carve it, when you hit it a certain way, it chips. So in order to get this beautiful rendition of the figure, right, of a naturalistic representation of the pharaoh, you have to have a lot of skill. So not only is there strength on the material being out of stone, but also how much money had to be placed onto the person who made these objects. He had to be a very highly skilled artist that he created this object. So a lot of money went into this, also showing the strength of the purse or the money of the pharaoh, and therefore also Egypt. So a lot of elements hidden in plain sight, and Egyptians would have read those elements really quickly. All right, last but not least, we're going to be talking about paintings, especially murals. So with murals, you're going to find a couple of things. The very first thing to understand is going to be the characteristic angle of the human figure, right? So think about your Egyptian stance where you have an arm up, right, and another down on the opposite side, and then the legs open up into an upside down V shape, kind of like an A shape, right? So you can see all four limbs. And that's because Egyptians, on this idea of strength, in order to show strength, you would avoid showing ambiguity, meaning you want it to always be as clear as possible. Okay, even though you did idealize something, right? You still showcase the pharaoh and make sure that the pharaoh looked like the pharaoh. You wanted to make sure that it was clear. There was no ambiguity. So here's a great example of that. Now, let me talk a little bit about the ambiguity and why this Egyptian stand, what we recognize as the Egyptian stand. Imagine if this individual was standing straight down, right? Arms down and legs put together. Now, if there were only an arm down and the legs put together, you could only see what he would had in his left hand and then what one of his feet or legs were doing. So in order to be less ambiguous, then it has to show both arms. You have to show what's in both hands, right? So in order to show what's in both hands in a flat image, then you have to have one in one side and the other one on the other, right? And the same thing with both legs. So if you think about the posture of the iconic Egyptian stand, in where you have both hands and both arms displayed out, it's because of that reason. You wanted to know what all four limbs were doing so you can keep from being ambiguous, right? Here, for example, another way of showing less ambiguity is that in this mural that showcases this person in power, right? It tells us everything about this individual, right? It tells us that this individual has a wife, has a daughter. Now, how do we know it's a daughter? Simple. It's not because of the haircut, but rather because she's holding the lily, right? We also know that this individual is fairly powerful. We know that because, one, he has a couple of scepters. He's not the pharaoh, but he's pretty much up there in power, plus a few other things that he's wearing. Now, another thing about this individual, just by looking at this object that is fairly clear, is that he owned land, right next to the Nile River. How do we know that? You can see here the waters, and then you can see the papyrus, and that tells us that's right there on the river. And the land that he owns is fairly abundant with birds specifically. So you can see all the birds and animals that inhabit his land. They're different kinds. So you can see all the different kinds of animals. He also has this duck here that allows him and helps him to hunt fish, or to fish. I mean, also with the waters, it shows you exactly what kind of fish he owned in those waters. Another thing that I find fascinating is his wife. He is definitely a protector, right? And I love the fact that she is completely adorned. I love the fact, I like to think about it, that he cares for her. I don't know if there is a good relationship between the two of them, but nevertheless he cares for her. He wants to make sure that she is completely adorned with anything and everything she wants. Now, if all this information was not clear about what he wanted, what he owned, and what he had, then you had information that was written, including their names. So all that information, everything in here for the Egyptians was about showing strength, and strength shown also through the lack of ambiguity in imagery and the information that was given. So very, very clear information. So clear that even for us nowadays, we can recognize in a fairly quick way the imagery of the Egyptians. And with that, it ends this lecture, guys. I apologize, I'm a little tired today, and as you can see, the lecture did not there he goes, did not go as smooth as normal, but oh well. Hopefully you guys got information, and I will be posting this in a little bit, and I'll start the next one pretty soon. Bye, guys.